And the Republican presidential field is poised to grow yet again this week, but there are already plenty of candidates here on the First in the Nation campaign trail. One of them is an international businessman and quality control standards expert, Perry Johnson, who is our guest this morning in studio. Thanks for joining us, Perry.
Well, thank you for having me.
So this might be the first time some people are seeing you in terms of being on the air in here in New Hampshire. So tell us a little bit about who you are and why you're running for president.
Well, I am a guy that started with nothing, but worked in the auto industry when it was struggling, and I thought I knew how to solve the problem. And what I did was introduce statistical methods, which caused us to dramatically improve our quality. And then I wrote a book on ISO 9000, the quality standard. It became literally something that was adopted around the world. And now Perry Johnson registrars and Perry Johnson laboratory accreditation do business in 61 countries around the world. I'm a guy that at one time, literally, could not pay his rent, was getting eviction notices because I couldn't pay rent. I had my gas shut off, stone broke, and now I live the American dream. And I want to keep that American dream alive. I spent my entire life bringing quality and efficiency to companies, and now I want to bring it to the American government.
Right now, former President Trump is the front runner in this Republican primary. What is the case you want to make as to why he should not be the nominee again in 2024?
Actually, I thought he was a great president, but he spent too much money. Keep in mind, right now, we are spending $610 per family just in interest payments. When Trump took office, we were $19.9 trillion in debt. 4 years later, we were another $8 trillion in debt. We've spent more money in the last 6 years than any time in history, and we're still spending more. So Trump just spent too much money.
Some of your fellow candidates say that you can't be taken seriously, not you specifically, but a candidate can't be taken seriously if they're not willing to take on Trump directly. What do you think of that?
I agree 100%. If you can't take Trump on directly, you're not going to win.
So how do you do it, though? I mean, he won the last primary by taking out opponents left and right.
He did, actually. I thought he was very good on the debate stage, but I'll be better. And it's going to be pretty hard to defend his going $8 trillion more in debt. Now, I think it's 87 companies. None of my companies ever went bankrupt. None of my companies have any debt. I have no personal debt. It's okay to bankrupt 5 or 6 companies, but you can't bankrupt the United States. And right now, we're not going broke, we are broke. 32 trillion in debt. When you have to borrow money from China to the tune of sending them literally $74 million a day in interest payments, you know you're on the wrong path.
Your plan is called 2 cents to save America. The idea is cutting 2 cents off of every dollar of discretionary spending from here on out. It's year after year. I'm curious, how do you know when to stop cutting? Because, I mean, about half of discretionary spending is military spending. So is there a point at which you have to say, okay, we've done enough?
Well, when we start, my path is to balance the budget. And we have to start balancing the budget. You don't do that by spending more money than you've ever spent in history. And what we do is freeze the budget right now and cut 2 cents out of every dollar. Understand, right now, the goal is to spend every penny in that budget. In fact, they incentivize people to do that. I said we do just the opposite. We cut 2 cents out of every dollar of discretionary spending every year. And some departments I would just get rid of. I would actually get rid of the whole Department of Education. We have 4,400 people, that's $68 billion out there. And let's say only 8% goes to the grades K through 12. I say we cut it down to 2 people and send that money directly to the parents and let the parents spend it wherever on the kids' education.
The abortion issue is one that's being sorted out on the campaign trail in the states. All of this is kind of up for grabs now in the post-Dobbs decision world. Where do you stand? You know, if a federal abortion ban of some kind reached your desk as president, would you sign it?
Well, I am pro-life, and everybody knows I'm pro-life. What I do know is that I think we've taken an extreme stance in some states, like Michigan. In Michigan, you can have an abortion at 40 weeks. Now, I have 3 sons. I think they were all born at 38 weeks. They're viable. You have a viable life on their own. When everybody talks about the position, nobody ever takes this. They said, who has the extreme position? We don't, they do. And in some cases, you can, when the baby's born, you can just let it sit there and die. This is not acceptable. It's acceptable in China, but it shouldn't be acceptable in the United States.
What about drawing a line at a certain level of weeks gestation? Where would you want to do that? 15 weeks, 6 weeks?
Well, my particular stance is, I am Catholic, and my stance is that at conception, but I am not in a position where I have to worry about that or even discuss that a whole lot, because the bottom line is that we already have a decision from the courts, and the states decide that. It's now much more of a state issue than it is a federal issue. I think even you have to agree with that.
Well, they didn't say the federal government can't, and I think that's part of why the discussion is all over the place right now. But we'll move on to energy policy. You said you want a revival of nuclear energy in this country. How do you make that happen? Because right now it doesn't look like the market is favoring that. It seems like more and more nuclear power plants are going offline.
Actually, we should do just the opposite. Nuclear energy is the cleanest form of energy, the least expensive form of energy. And as you see in my book, I think we should produce as much oil as possible. Nobody in the world does a better job of extracting and refining oil than the United States. We're the best in the world. We're the best in the world at turning it into natural gas so that we have a minimum amount of methane entering the air. And yet, what do? We actually curtailed the production of oil, and we had to buy from Russia, which does a much worse job. 5 times the amount of methane goes into the air when they produce the natural gas, and we gave them $61 billion in the process. Now, does that really make any sense?
Do you plan to incentivize nuclear power, though? How do you plan to bring back nuclear power?
We do have to incentivize nuclear power. And again, we have to use some common sense. Now, that's something that I can talk about, because that's something the government can really do.
What about the Paris Climate Accord? This is something, obviously, President Trump pulled the United States out of it. President Biden puts the United States back into it. Does a President Johnson pull the United States back out?
Let me make it very clear. I own a Clean Development Mechanism company, which actually measures the amount of greenhouse gas. And the person that I actually have running the program, the person that I had was the person that was actually in charge of this. The United States could never sign that. Clinton didn't sign it. We never should have signed it. The reason is that it's a totally unfair arrangement. We have China that is already increasing the amount of pollution that they're putting into the air every year, and they say that's okay. In fact, when they're making the batteries, they're using coal to make the batteries. And some of these batteries that are produced, it's so bad, it like destroys the earth. You'd have to drive a car for 7 years in order to get to the amount of pollution that they put into the air making one battery. Now, this is not acceptable. The bottom line is that the Paris Accord was totally unfair in the way they looked at it. And the reason Clinton didn't sign it, the reason Bush didn't sign it, the reason I wouldn't sign it, the reason that Trump wouldn't sign it, is that it is the single most unfair thing I've ever seen in my life. Have you had a chance to even read it?
Not the whole thing, no.
It's horrible. And the United States is always put in a position where they are at a disadvantage. And we have to change that. Even in NATO, think of it. Don't you think it's reasonable that Germany ought to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense? They don't. It makes no sense. They're the biggest economy in all of Europe.
You've been very successful in business, and along the same lines of climate change, there's this push to do this ESG investing now, environmental, social, and governance. What's your perspective on that, and should the government be trying to stamp that out, or let the market allow it to fail if it will?
Well, as you know, I'm a free market guy. So my whole philosophy is that the government is too big. I want to shrink the government. I'm a guy that believes that the government should stay out of almost everything. It doesn't matter what it is. The government should stay out. The federal government. I'm a guy that believes that the state should have more power and influence than the federal government. And every time the government gets involved, I think it turns negative. So you're talking to the one guy that really believes in one basic slogan. You have it right on your license plates. You know, live free or die. And I believe that that has been a motto that we should follow. And the government has just gotten bigger and bigger. If you saw my one ad, this bloated government, we have to stop it. And so I'm a guy that believes shrink the government. and shrink the government's influence.
What about in the realm of artificial intelligence? We just saw a letter coming out from some of the greatest innovators in this realm, essentially saying, help us. We need the government to step in and do something because they feel that AI will present some kind of existential threat to humanity at some point. Is that something the government should look at trying to regulate better?
You know my thinking. I don't like the government getting involved in just about anything. No matter what it is, I think the government ought to stay out. I think it should be decided by states as much as possible. In things like that, we know we have innovation all over. We had movements like that. Go back, there was the electric typewriter. I remember when that came in, we're talking about many years ago, my dad was saying that the government should, that the secretaries think the government should step in because it's going to reduce the secretarial staff. Then the computer came in, and then my dad had to get rid of 67 people that were laid off. And the comments were, well, there are not going to be enough jobs for people. Heck, we've got a computer. Well, look at what's happened now. The computer is now a way of life for everyone. So we are going to advance, and the artificial intelligence is an amazing thing. Now, could it get scary? Well, a lot of what we do later on does get scary, but we manage to adjust.
All right. Well, Perry Johnson, thank you so much for joining us on Close Up. We'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
Thank you.